Thank you for joining us at the 2014 Sustaining Our World Lecture. Now, please welcome Tom DeLuca, Director of the School of Environmental and Forest Sciences.
Thank you, and welcome everybody. Just a quick bookkeeping item before we get started. After Michael's given his talk today, if you have a question, we'd like you to come to the microphone at the side of the room because this is being filmed and we want a clear message to come across when you ask your question. So please come to the microphone if you have a question at the end of the talk and state your name and ask your question. And with that, I'm really pleased to and it's a pleasure and a privilege to introduce our speaker tonight, who's come all the way down from Vancouver to join us. And we're really honored to have with us tonight Michael Green, giving our Sustaining Our World lecture. As you may remember, last year we had Tom Knittel, also an architect, come and talk to us about architecture and taking cues from nature and designing sustainable buildings and communities. And this year we follow up on that theme with another architect, Michael Green, who is not only a leader and an innovator in the world of architecture and interior design, but somebody that specifically focuses on using nature's products. Michael has been recognized for his award-winning buildings, public art, interiors, landscape, and urban environments. He founded his own architectural and interior design firm in 2012 and has given talks and taught courses around the world. His projects have ranged from international airports to skyscrapers to smaller homes, retail spaces, and he's currently working on a sustainable community in the mountains of Central Asia. One of the common threads in uniting all of Michael's projects and connecting them directly to our school tonight is his love of wood and his love of building with wood. There's something really simple yet transformative about building with wood. It's one of the oldest and most widely used construction materials on the planet. Whether we played with blocks as a kid or work with it with wood for a living, we all have some connection to trees and forests and the resources they provide. Yet for all the experience that we have with wood, for all the things we know about it, Michael believes that wood still has a vast untapped potential as a building material. In particular, with our increasingly urban society, Michael doesn't see wood as a secondary element of design, but rather, and construction. He sees it quite literally as the foundation of sustainable building. And he's been exploring ways to use wood in structures for up to 30 stories tall. And again, the use of wood only brings our urban societies that much closer to nature. Central to his philosophy as well is the importance of where the wood comes from, how it's produced. He's talking about wood grown locally and wood grown sustainably, harvested responsibly, wood that will remain renewable for generations to come, and support thousands of jobs across multiple industries. That's what makes Michael's work so integrative and important. By reimagining how we use wood as a building material, he believes we can address a host of overlapping challenges, from climate change to urban development to affordable housing and sustainable forest management. And with that, I'll stop stealing Michael's talk tonight and turn it over to the star of the show, Michael.
My mics just came flying out of my pocket here. Hold on a second. Well, it's nice just to come down the road from Vancouver. I've never gotten to speak at University of Washington. It's really exciting. Love the program here, so it's been it's been something I've been looking forward to coming. I do a fair amount of speaking, and tonight I'm going to approach this subject a little bit differently. But I want to tell you a little bit of the story of why why in my practice I've sort of really come to love and believe in wood. And I thought it was kind of appropriate. I found this quote about a week ago, and I was writing an article for a Japanese magazine. I had this whole great idea of how I was going to do it and really talk about why from a different perspective, why I really connect with the forest, natural, you know, a sort of natural relationship that we, as man, really have and need to bring into the built environment. And so I love this quote here from Pablo Neruda: "You can cut all the flowers, but you cannot keep spring from coming." And the reason I loved it is I like the idea that for the last century, we've really been building buildings and cities out of the same two materials, concrete and steel. And we really haven't had anything else to kind of reinvent from. And so I like to think in my profession as an architect that we really are in a new springtime. We're in a completely new sort of opportunity to change the way we build and change the way we think rather than just tinker with it. And the reason is I think we're going to have this next century where climate change issues are so profoundly important in the design world that we need to, you know, we need to strip down and reinvent. The reason this talk is so different is that when I submitted this first draft of my essay to the Japanese magazine, they completely rejected it. And they rejected it because I wrote a poem to start. And I figured, well, they've rejected it, but I'll just make you guys suffer through me reading this. And I called it Springtime. So we're in springtime. A ragged edge of branches and boughs cluster at the treetops. Treetops as tall as city skylines, but far, far more wondrous. Trees that have twisted not because of the aesthetic whim, but of necessity. Beauty shaped by the science of survival. Shape searching for power driven by the sun, and shelter twisted by the wind. Complex muscular limbs evolved to carry the weight of snow, Darwinian designs of the most modern society. These are our forests, this is the tree, and it is spring. So I thought that was kind of a fun way for me to start, because I do think that the reference in nature is really changing the way I think about my work and the way a lot of architects are thinking about the work. I spent a lot of time in the woods, and you know, I think about how much I take for granted when I walk down a forest path. The complexity all around us, how we all take for granted the complexity of the nature around us and the natural systems. Walking down the street in the city is the same way. We take for granted the incredible footprint of everything we've made, and we've really just come to sort of take it for granted. The world is paved over, and we've taken it for granted, and we haven't really had these opportunities to rethink. But I like to think that we're in this process of rethinking because, as I like to say, the world's most advanced building material, currently anyway, is wood. And so I say this a lot, and fortunately, popular science has agreed with us on this. I like to joke that they, you know, I can quote them and they can quote me back and forth, and perhaps nobody knows who originally said it. But I think this is really true. And the science of wood is really changing, starting with that idea that, you know, the most simple things really can become the most profound solutions, which Buckminster Fuller's a great engineer. This quote, that there's nothing in a caterpillar that tells you it's going to be a butterfly, which is very much where we are with wood. So the thing when we talk about wood, most people think about wood buildings this way. And if you live in North America, as we all do, we've been building this way for 300 or 400 years. There's not a lot new in the way we build in lightweight wood. But obviously that's going to change. Living in Vancouver, Vancouver's got this goal of being the greenest city, like lots of cities do. By 2020. One really nice part of our story is that we've just changed the company that powers the steam loop for the whole central core of Vancouver has just made a decision to move from natural gas to biomass, and that's going to cut Vancouver's greenhouse gas emissions by 25% by 2020. So we're actually going to get to where we are going, and that's going to be driven by, believe it or not, food waste and then wood biomass. So, you know, we are making headway. But sometimes I have to kind of step back and say, as beautiful as Vancouver is, as beautiful as Seattle is, Vancouver looks like this a lot of days, right? We live in the rain, and we effectively live in a concrete jungle. There's not a lot of nature around us. We build buildings the same way over and over and over, and we really don't step back and say, does this make any sense? The statistics really kind of bear true. So 40% of carbon emissions in North America are the result of the making and operating of buildings. The same is true in energy. 49% of our energy use in North America is from the making and operating of buildings. Transportation is second on that list. It's kind of the main conversation, but buildings are really, it's the single largest industry that will impact how we look at energy and climate change in the future. And the change that's happening is pretty serious, because we see, if you pick up a lot of architectural magazines right now, you pick up Dwell and sort of, at the airport, you're going to see a lot of conversation about solutions that are really suburban scale solutions. Ideas of using natural materials at a very suburban scale, maybe 3 stories, maybe 4 stories. But right now the world's 50% urbanized, and we're going to move to 75% urbanized in a really short amount of time. And when that happens, we need to shift the kinds of buildings we're talking about. We can't solve the sort of climate issues and the energy issues by moving a straw bale construction. As good as that is, it's not going to actually be an effective way to solve it. And it doesn't match the scale of where we're going to live. So a couple statistics, if you don't know them, that are really, really mind-blowing, is that 350 million people in China are going to move from rural environments into cities in the next 15 years, maybe even less. And 215 million people are going to do the same in India. So that's far more than all the people in North America moving from farms into urban environments, and they all need a home. And they're all going to build, for the most part, out of concrete and concrete block. And concrete owns about 5 to 8% of man's greenhouse gas emissions. So what we know is urbanization and how we build in big cities is going to change, is going to increase our carbon footprint. It's going to increase our energy footprint, but even worse, here we are trying to solve a human need to provide shelter, and when we do, we're going to be causing this even greater impact on climate. So I like to point out when I talk to architects and engineers, and I can see you in the room, by the way, I can see the black out there, there's 3 of you. Not the engineers, scratch that, the architects. But I like to think as an architect, and my friends in the engineering business, is that we are the game changers. We have to strip down and actually start over the way we think. And we've sort of moved to these sort of conversations of what a sustainable building is, but 9 times out of 10, the solution is to build a concrete building and then start adding stuff to it to make it sustainable. We might, add PV to it and actually improve the energy performance, but largely we're still adding on to find solutions rather than taking it back to ultimately the way nature looks at it, which is only make it if it's necessary, only make it if it's necessary to survive. And so, of course, it's not just architects and engineers that are going to solve the problem. It's going to be developers and contractors and all these folks. And ultimately, the reason I'm here is that the answer is going to come from the forest. And I guess the answer also, in that it's going to come from the forest, and I'm going to take you through the story of where I think it's going to go in urban environments, the forest is also the problem. If we take from the forest in the wrong way, it's also, obviously, I'm speaking to the right environment for you guys to know this, but when I talk, especially in foreign countries, when I talk, the problem always comes up in that question of, can we do this, or is it going to, are we going to just exacerbate climate change issues by deforestation? And the answer is yes, we would if we do this irresponsibly. So there is a way, but it requires that we continue to work on well-managed forest practices and, frankly, developing better certification programs globally to ensure that we don't harvest from the wrong place. So I'm sure all of you guys know this, but just to kind of reiterate it, the reason this matters so much is that a cubic meter of wood sequesters roughly a ton of carbon dioxide, up to 1.6 depending on who we read. But what we know is, unlike steel and concrete, these 2 materials that really have built our cities for the last century, who have huge energy and huge carbon dioxide footprints, wood gives us this unique alternative, the ability to store. And it means we have to really kind of step back and thank these 2 folks here as maybe the people that'll save the planet. But it's a circle, and requires the cooperation of everyone. And I have to say, within my field, what we have lacked for the last century is our ability to go back to the people that make the materials or work on production of the materials and ask them to work with us. We're seeing greater collaboration in the way we work now, where the fabricators and the designers are starting to talk more so that we can actually fix the problem. So going back to the light wood frame building and it being an urban problem, if you've seen my TED Talk, I apologize because I do a couple things that are from it, but it's useful. You know, we all live here in forests that grow to these amazing heights. In Vancouver, there was a project at the University of British Columbia where they're going to build a whole bunch of residential towers. And the zoning regulation basically said, that's sure, you can build a bunch of tall buildings here, but make sure we can't see them above the treetops. And that made those buildings a maximum of 18 stories tall. So I sit on the design panel to review projects coming into UBC, and here are all these proposals for concrete building after concrete building, literally across the street from trees that are the exact same height. Obviously, there's a conversation of why can't we build buildings much taller, but here in Washington State and lots of places, we still have these limits of height. In BC, we now have 6 stories we're allowed to build in wood, but everywhere they've sort of capped out how tall we can build wood buildings for these urban environments. Everywhere they've done it on the assumption that we're going to build the exact same way we've been building for hundreds of years with lightweight wood frame construction. So our work has been really about, you know, this number, 30 stories. That was a number we threw out. I threw out in Australia first about 7, 8 years ago, and people thought we were crazy. There's no way you can build a wood building this tall. And in fact, one of the best engineering firms in the world, the leader of their wood sector out of the UK was with me, and he said, absolutely, you can't build wood buildings above 10 stories. But in the last 8 years, what's been happening is this shift and this sort of awareness that not only is it a good idea to start looking at, you know, these wood as a material at larger scale, but it's actually very realistic for us to build at these scales. We just have to completely reinvent the building code systems and really ultimately change the way people think. So now we're actually talking about going much higher than 30 stories. And in fact, there's a study that came out with SOM, who are a big, you know, huge architecture engineering firm based in Chicago, but all over the United States, all over the world, who also built Burj Khalifa, the world's tallest building. They did a study that said they can do 42 stories by combining concrete with wood. So now what we're seeing is that an idea that at first seemed kind of insane to build, you know, in this very new way, because we largely have only had for the last 130 years these two materials of concrete and steel. Now all of a sudden we're seeing people say, oh, maybe that does make sense. And you know, this came out about a week ago in The Economist. It's a great sort of moment, and I love that you know, title, Barking Up the Right Tree. The White House announced, I'm sure a lot of you know, through the USDA announced investment in advanced wood products and ultimately in looking at these tall buildings as a potential solution. But what I like to say is that the engineering of these buildings is pretty tough. I'm going to show you some of these in a second. But really, this is the hardest part. It's so strange to think that all of us have all this technology around us. I mean, just look at me in front of all this technology. We've become so used to, with our telephones, getting a new one all the time. The amount of technology that's packed into that phone is incredible. But when we talk about buildings, we get really nervous about any ideas that are, you know, reinventing the wheel. And so, you know, we get a lot of resistance. We've had a lot of resistance. That's starting to change. Governments are starting to realize this actually makes quite a bit of sense. If we can build more responsibly with a renewable material that's grown by the sun, that sequesters carbon, that helps our forest economies, then maybe we actually are onto something. So it's starting to change. Now for me, my beginning actually started at a firm called Caesar Pelli. And actually I was a super young architect. I worked on the Petronas Towers, the world's tallest at the time. And I also worked on a project here at the University of Washington that I've never seen until I drove by it this afternoon. And to be honest with you, I literally was like doing colored pencils. I was so junior on the thing, I didn't really have much to do with it, but your physics building here. You know, at Caesar's office, what I saw though is this race for height and the competition that happened between cities, between developers, between countries, where everybody wanted to be first, even between these two towers. One of these towers was built by a Korean contractor and one by a Japanese contractor, and you could see them just chasing each other up to try to be the first to top out. That idea is a wonderful thing. The skylines of the last century really were defined by this race and this competitive spirit. So you had in New York City the Chrysler Building being built, and all of a sudden they wanted to build the Empire State. And it had to be higher, and it had to be faster, and it had to be done before the Chrysler Building. That spirit is exactly the spirit that these ideas of building tall are all about. This is, I sometimes tell people the story that every country I go to, I figure out who your rival is, and then I poke a little bit, right? So I go to New Zealand and I say, you know, the Aussies are doing really great. They're getting into this thing, and then vice versa. And truthfully, I come south of the border here, and by the way, I am an American, so bear with me as I give you a hard time. I'm American and Canadian, but you know, I like to say that, you know, the U.S. right now, and this is true, is kind of last to the race in the developed world for these new wood technologies. You know, these really started, I'll describe them in a minute in more detail. They started in Central Europe, but now they've spread in a lot of places. And now, as of that announcement a week and a half ago or whatever it is now, the U.S. is in the game. And what we know is as soon as the U.S. enters any game, you guys like to be first, and that is a good thing because we'll push the investment and these ideas, and these will become more commonplace. So for me, I moved to Vancouver 16 years ago. I was actually born in the Canadian Arctic where no trees grow, ironically, way above where the tree line is in the Canadian Arctic. But when I moved from Caesar's office, where we did these ridiculously big skyscrapers, to Vancouver, I immediately remembered wood, a material that I'd grown up building with my grandfather, in my wood shop, the sort of, you know, relationship that I had to wood that goes right back to our childhood blocks and childhood toys. And I immediately remembered that, you know, none of this stuff that I'm talking about is at all new. So this is my office in Vancouver, and it's built in a building that I am not allowed to build by the building code in British Columbia today, and it's 105 years old. So we have buildings in Vancouver, and I'm sure you guys do here too, that are 7, 8, 9 stories tall in wood, and they're 100 years old. But what happened is, as soon as we had steel and concrete, architects and engineers and city officials really sort of abandoned wood as a concept 100 years ago. It burns, it can't be good, let's just move on. And what we're starting to realize is actually no, a lot of these ideas were very strong 100 years ago, we just need to bring them back. I park next to, in the basement of this building, next to wood columns this big. There are some concrete columns protected by steel, but the wood columns don't get any protection when I drive my car in there. And the top of the columns where they meet the beams, there's little parts where there's some drywall there. The only reason it's there is it's protecting the steel connections. The way we solved problems 100 years ago with wood was to wrap wood around steel, because steel's more vulnerable to fire than wood, than massive wood. And now we're bringing back those same ideas. So I feel pretty lucky to work in a space with these amazing columns. And my little firm, we have 20 people in Vancouver, and we used to have an office in New York, but we're closed right now. Became committed to this idea that if we're going to work in wood and we're going to work in these in urban environments, we're going to have to work much bigger than we ever thought before. And we turned to these 3 products that we call mass timber panels. So you guys probably, a lot of you have heard of cross-laminated timber. That's probably the most common one. And I'm sure you guys have heard of laminated veneer lumber and laminated strand lumber probably. But those are materials, these two, LVL and LSL, are materials we chop up into small pieces. They're made by companies like Louisiana Pacific and Weyerhaeuser, but we chop them into small beams and we bury them inside walls in lightweight wood frame buildings. When they make them, they actually make these materials in huge sheets, 8 feet wide, 64 feet long, and different thicknesses. And so we became really interested in how do we take these huge panels, and cross-laminated timber is typically in North America 10 feet wide, 40 feet long, and in various thicknesses. You'll see some projects in a sec. These huge panels are shifting the scale of what we can build. That's the game changer. But more importantly, unlike my office, which is old growth, big, beautiful, Doug fir old growth, you can't even hammer a nail into, it's so hard. This is using lower grade woods, in some cases very fast growing woods, laminating them together to take that natural strength and creating the opposition of the fibers and forces to make these incredibly large panels. So we're no longer having to harvest the old growth. We're able to use wood. And in the case of the Canadian government, what they realize is we've got this huge tract of dead standing beetle kill wood, right? The mountain pine beetle has devastated our forest. The wood is standing and dead. If we don't harvest it, it'll fall and rot, and that'll be that. If we harvest it, we grab the carbon that's sequestered in it, and we have to find a use for it. And so what we realized about 8 years ago is that if we glue it together and make these CLT panels, we could find a new use and create these new markets for a product that otherwise would be wasted. And so that set my firm on this path to only working in these materials. And so I'm going to show you some buildings. Now, when CLT, cross-laminated timber, was developed first in Austria and became pretty popular in Austria, Germany, Switzerland, and the reason it did is in their markets, nobody would build in wood. I mean, only 20% of Austrian homes were made of wood. And the wood industry said, well, we want to make more of these. We want, and how do we do it? Well, nobody wanted to, the consumers in Austria didn't want to buy lightweight wood frame buildings like we get in North America, 2x4 buildings, because you can hear people walking in the floor next door. And they're used to concrete and massive buildings. And so the wood industry said, okay, well, we'll just turn wood into these massive products. And that's really the beginning of CLT. That was their motivation, was just to get more market share. Here in North America, it's a totally different story. Small houses, residential projects, single family, up to 3-4 stories, we're used to building in lightweight wood. We weren't going to change the wood industry or the building industry by taking these huge panels and starting to build them, make them effective in small houses. So instead, we started looking at them and realizing these panels, because of their scale, allow us to move into these urban environments. But when we started our work on these ideas, nobody made cross-laminated timber in British Columbia, or for that matter, in North America. It was just being introduced to the market. But LVL and LSL have been made for a long time, and so we decided we would do this project, which is City Hall in North Vancouver, and we would do it out of LSL. And we would use it as a tool. It's a addition to an existing concrete building. So on the left is the existing building, and the big cantilever is the new wood piece. And we would do it as a tool because we were already exploring these ideas of how to build big, but what we knew is we needed to work in these huge panel sizes. So we convinced, in this case, Weyerhaeuser to give us these huge panels. They're 32 feet long and 8 feet wide, and glued them together to make this space, which is typically, this material is typically just abandoned into it's buried behind gypsum. But we said, no, it's beautiful. It's actually all aspen. It's a beautiful material. It's made out of small little, flakes glued together. It's very strong. And we wanted to show how it could actually work so that we could then take these ideas and start building taller and taller. And so I'll just show you a couple images of this project. But it was very interesting. It was a very interesting process because about halfway through, CLT came to Canada. So CLT, cross-laminated timber, there are 2 manufacturers right now in North America, 2 big manufacturers, one in British Columbia and one in Quebec. Nobody here in the States yet. And so, if you can't have lots of competitive materials, if you can't have 3 companies, it's hard to keep prices down. And so by introducing laminated strand lumber as a competitor to CLT, we realized we could keep the prices down and make these ideas start to happen. So because our government in British Columbia realized this is good for our economy, it's good for our small forestry communities, they also recognized that they weren't going to be able to sell these CLT or these mass timber panels into the small scale residential market. They started to turn to folks like Andrew Waugh in the United Kingdom and ourselves that were interested in moving into these urban environments. And at the time when the downturn in the US economy happened, what happened in 2008, or the global economy really happened, we used to export a lot of our wood down here to the States, and the housing market collapsed here and everywhere. And so we turned to China, started sending our wood to China. And we still send a huge amount of our wood to China. But when we send our wood to China, China uses it to make formwork for concrete buildings. And then they take all that leftover wood from the formwork and they throw it in the landfill. It's a travesty. So one of the things I really believe is that if you cut down a tree, you honor that tree's life by finding an incredible use for it. Even if it's the most spindly, awkward tree, its life, is valuable. And we can turn it into great buildings, even though it's, a lot of people throw it away. But we certainly can't be using our wood to create formwork for concrete, given all this conversation we've had already about the impact of concrete. And we certainly can't return our wood to the landfill where it's just going to eventually rot and give back that carbon dioxide. What's the point? And so I was pretty upset about it. I actually, had a conversation with our Minister of Forestry and ultimately our Premier about it. And we said, no, that we've got to start pushing the envelope and building bigger and bigger. And so thankfully, the province of British Columbia said, okay, we'll let you do this and we'll let you do it outside of our building codes because we don't allow it. But then they said you have to build it in Prince George. I don't know if you guys know where that is. Anybody from Prince George, before I say too much? I actually love this town because they've been incredibly kind and great to us, but this is really remote, central northern BC, and they decided that we're going to build this Wood Innovation Design Center. So the fun thing about this building is that it's a real game changer. And I'm pretty excited about it. We've actually, tomorrow, I'm topping out the building, the structure's topping out with our Premier tomorrow, so that's where I head from here, actually. And so this building's already built. The main frame is up. Everything's wood, and that's a real change. So we're not used to building this way, and so it means that we have a huge amount of research that goes into it. So we lean heavily on the National Research Council of Canada and the Forest Innovation folks in BC and different testing people to say, how does it work for acoustics and how does it work for fire and how are these buildings really going to technically perform, because there are no examples for us. It's a great way to lose money, by the way, if you are an architect, to get involved in this kind of stuff. But it's so meaningful and it's so fun and it's so exciting because you are on uncharted territory when you build this way. So this building's unique because it's made out of cross-laminated timber panels and there is no concrete. So the early versions of these buildings, and we've been building these taller buildings. Andrew Waugh in the UK built a building in London that's 9 stories tall, and that was finished probably about 6 years ago now. When he first built it, it had to, for fire, be covered up. So they built this beautiful wood building and then completely covered it up with drywall to protect it from fire. I don't think these ideas, if you're going to change a system dramatically, it's got to be cost effective. It can't be about environmental issues. That might be my motivation, but that's not going to be the consumer's motivation 9 times out of 10. So it's got to be cost effective and it's got to be beautiful. Wood is beautiful and we got to showcase it, which meant we had to reinvent the way we did it. So in this case, what we've figured out how to do actually is have these floor slabs that are stacked on top of each other. I won't go into the engineering side of it, but it's really exciting for nerdy wood people like me. Hides all the services, all the sprinklers and everything, so that just the wood is exposed. Kind of like a concrete building hides things inside the concrete. We've figured out how to do the same inside these wood buildings. And most importantly, normally these buildings have always, to date, always had a concrete topping on top of the floor. And they do that to, just a thin concrete topping, they do that to control sound. But we've figured out how not to do that. And why that matters is that buildings have a life cycle. And when we traditionally look at the life cycle of wood buildings versus concrete buildings or masonry buildings or steel, wood sometimes suffers because people assume it won't last as long, it's not as durable, and then what happens to the wood at the end of when the building's done? Concrete you could theoretically grind up and use as an aggregate. Steel can get recycled. So what's the end story with wood? Well, the beauty of these systems is the end story literally is unscrew it and build a whole nother building. As long as the wood is protected on the outside, we can actually just keep going with this material. It's certainly going to last as long as a structure, as long as you maintain the exterior enclosure of the building as concrete or steel. But most importantly, you can take it apart. But you can't take it apart if you top everything with concrete. It makes it a lot more complicated. So we've now figured out how these buildings will not only go together incredibly quickly and cost effectively, but also how they go together dry. We call it dry construction. And if we get rid of the concrete, we solve all kinds of problems for dismantling the building. So we're pretty excited about it. Actually, we use impregnated sand panels that dampen the sound in it. So it's a highly unusual building to walk around because it's all exposed wood. And it's pretty exciting. Every aspect of this building is wood. I think I have a little movie, actually. I'll jump forward to see if this goes here. Okay, I'm going to talk over the sound too. Because the funny part is, if you saw my TED Talk, I do a little movie in there. You're not allowed to put sound to a movie. This is YouTube, Beautiful Day, the sound. So Bono spoke at TED last year with me, and I thought, cool, I'll show up at TED and I'll get Bono's permission to be able to put this song on my little video. He said absolutely not, so that didn't happen. So anyway, this building's, what's cool about it is the Wood Innovation Design Center. So it's actually a building, sorry, I'm supposed to stay in the light for the TV camera. It's a building about wood innovation. It's actually for the University of Northern British Columbia. They're going to put an engineering program in for the study of tall wood buildings. So this is actually currently the world's tallest wood building as of this week, which is pretty exciting. So there are a bunch of these buildings being built, and as you can see, I had this funny experience of speaking at the Architectural Innovation Conference in New York with Bill Baker, who's the guy that designed Burj Khalifa, the tallest building in the world. So he got up and talked about that, and then I got up and talked about this and said, look how tall they are, isn't it great? It felt ridiculous, but but we're getting somewhere. And as I said, that competitive spirit's what's going to take it. And the reason this is going to happen is because it is cost effective. And the reason it's cost effective is because these panels go together really simply and quickly. This Prince George, an anecdote I like to tell is the Prince George project is about 8 blocks away from a Delta hotel that's being constructed in steel. Our site, the only noise you hear on our site is cordless screw guns, very quiet, and all you hear is the sound of the construction site 8 blocks away. Putting together a wood building like this is quiet. It's completely different than what we're used to. And these things have real meaning. So this is what it looks like, these big panels going in. It's beautiful, right? It's pretty low grade spruce in this case, oops. And, but it's incredibly beautiful. And now that this building's built, we're going to use it as a tool to actually bring code officials and different people that are interested in, anybody here that would like to see it, we'd love to give you a tour because it's a learning tool. This is the airport in Prince George, which I also designed and built about 8 years ago. The building, the Whittick project, should have this same feeling when it's done. And it's a community that really has embraced the idea of wood. So I like to show these images just to kind of say this is what's coming. So really quickly, I'm going to show you a couple more things. This is the next one we're doing. It's, if you know Vancouver, that's Science World, the little globe there. This is a vertical farm. It's actually the food bank on the left, a public market on the right, on the ground floor, a main level of a roof plaza level that's got all this agriculture on it, and then it is 8 stories of vertical farming where we use a digester, an organics digester to basically power the greenhouse, the vertical greenhouse. And then it has a hotel, and then on top there are, it's more of a greenhouse for flowering fruits and vegetables and a restaurant built literally into the greenhouse so that we get this incredible view of downtown Vancouver in a 20-story tall wood building that shatters that, twice the height of the last building I just showed you. So all going well, this is our next step in Vancouver, and the city of Vancouver is really excited about this. I got some hurdles to get through financially to make this happen, but it seems to be going well. We also have our universities that have said they're going to build an 18-story dormitory in wood. So although these ideas are still pretty early, the buy-in is starting to happen. And every day I get somebody emails me from somewhere around the world. Somebody in Sweden wants to build 32 stories. Somebody else wants to build 22. It's really a great time because we don't know what these buildings are going to look like. We don't know what the character of them is going to be. This is kind of a beginning. But every time we touch them, we invent a whole new way to build. So this vertical farm is built in a completely different way where we figured out how to use less of these materials so they're more cost effective, but in a neat way that allows us to hide all our services, actually create a very effective acoustic solution, which is a challenge, and to make it faster to build. So this is kind of a zigzag system we're currently working on. So the thing is, it's not just about height, and I'll just show you a few more. So what I'd like to see is that we start seeing in the United States, because the building codes don't allow it, these new mass timber panels are going to allow us to build buildings on university campuses. So if you walk around your campus, everything's masonry, and the assumption is it's got to be built on top of masonry or built on top of concrete. And almost all your buildings here likely are, and some steel, no doubt, too. But I imagine there aren't a lot of wood buildings. I know the forestry school has some. So I wanted to talk about that. The idea that building a building structure is not the same thing as the building look. And this is Ronald McDonald House in Vancouver. It's the third largest Ronald McDonald House in the world. It'll house 73 families. It's a project that I love to talk about in a completely different way that I'm going to talk about tonight, about the sort of social kind of quality of this building. But it's also a brick building. But it's a brick building that's built on top of CLT, which I'll show you in a moment. And that's what the construction of this building looked like. Because we live in a seismically active area, if you build a big masonry building, you know, and even not at great heights, but in this case it's a 4-story building, I don't feel comfortable putting that on 2x4 construction, and I want to use wood. Everybody normally would turn to concrete or concrete block. We now have a completely new way to build because these panels literally tilt up 4 stories at a time, go together really quickly, and you can clad them however you want. They don't have to look like wood buildings. That's important because in a university campus, as an example, the assumption is everything's got to stay within this sort of campus aesthetic, right? So one of the things I'm kind of working on now is trying to convince, especially institutions, this idea that, you know, concrete buildings, you know, often, or sorry, stone buildings don't look like concrete. They look like stone on the outside. So this is going to be a game changer, I think, for lower buildings using these new materials. And now, unlike that story where we're exporting all these 2x4s to China to turn them into formwork, we have a material that doesn't even have to wait until the building codes change, that'll actually change the way we build even at low scale for these long-term institutional buildings. So this project's actually finishing in a month. And when you walk around it, it does not feel like it's finishing in a month at all, but it's pretty cool. And if you come to Vancouver, come for a tour if you're interested, because it's an amazing facility. And my firm's been involved with Ronald McDonald House for 5 years now. We go in and cook meals for the families, and it's just a really rewarding place. But it's also really exciting because you're going to have this building with a lot of exposed on the inside, a lot of this exposed wood. Big slides and these crazy big stairs. There's the stairs going in. That's what CLT, you can see in the top right there, that's what a CLT panel looks like. It's cross-laminated wood. So you can see how thick that is. That's that thick. These are big, big, big quantities of wood, but again, fairly low-grade wood for what they're able to do. So one of the things I often point out is that the building looks spectacular when it looked like this. But you can't leave it like this. The neighbors were all bummed out when we covered it up with brick and said, why didn't you leave the wood? But you got to protect it. So, but you can see that it's a really different look of how a building gets built because you're lifting these big panels. There's no waste on site. Everything gets cut before it shows up. And it allows us to use wood in new ways. So really quickly, I'll just scroll through a couple more projects. This is a laminated veneer lumber. And this is a warehouse, but it's so beautiful. That's the inside of somebody's office, all in solid wood. This is a building we're building on the summit of Whistler at the top of Harmony. We get 3 months to build it. These panels allow us to build really quickly. The snow load up here is 12 feet of wet snow. That's what we have to design for. They're really strong panels. We can helicopter them into an environment where we normally can't build and get a spectacular building with an incredible view. So we're pretty excited about this one. This is in the Canadian Arctic. Same thing. In the Canadian Arctic, if we were to build conventionally, it costs a lot of money and you get a very short season to build because of the snow. This is what it looks like in the summertime. So we took sort of the aesthetic of the igloo and are now building these wood, this is a cultural center for the Inuit. You guys call Eskimo, but Inuit. And again, just by using these large panels, we're able to build in an environment that we normally would not be able to build so cost effectively. This is a house on an island, same story. Everything has to be barged in. So we're using these panels to kind of open up new places that we can actually build more quickly and more cost effectively and get way more beautiful buildings. So this is under construction, actually. These are just renderings. And then I mentioned China, and I guess I'm gonna do one more project after this, but if you go to China, it's a shocking thing. I've only been twice this year, and I've been just absolutely blown away by the quantity of concrete buildings you see, towers. Every 5 minutes you see 20 towers under construction that are 30 stories tall. They're built side by side like dominoes. There's sometimes smokestacks coming off of power plants that blow right into the side of the building. The air quality is just unbelievably bad. So we were asked to design a contemporary art gallery in Xi'an, which is where the terracotta warriors are. This is our site visit, and when we stood there, that's pollution. When I asked the client, this is our site, I asked them, are there mountains around that we could see? They literally said to me, we're not sure, we've never been able to see very far. They're so used to think it was fog. And actually, just nice little anecdote, because the US Embassy in Beijing started posting on the edge of the building what the air quality was, and people in Beijing started to become aware of the air quality, that's the only reason that China really finally started disclosing to its own citizens just how bad the air is. So we have this cool little opportunity where we're going to introduce these panels for the first time ever to China. China's the place we need these panels. This is the change that needs to happen. They are building faster and bigger than any of us can imagine. And so they're the game changer. So when I lectured to them, much like I mentioned the idea of the Kiwis and the Aussies and riling them up in competition, when I talk to China now, I point out, because of their system, they don't have to wait 10 years for building codes to catch up with innovation. They just need to wave a wand and say it happens. That's the elegance of their system, and I push them. I like to say, the Americans can't do that, you can do it. But we need them to do that, right? We need them to do that, and we have to be part of it. And that's actually, if you're in forestry here, that's actually our role. The reforestation, you probably know, in China is faster than any other place on earth right now. Our forestry schools are filled with Chinese students. There is an interest in this, but it's just beginning in China. And so we're trying to bring these panels to say, let's get on it, let's start building, and let's value add out of our materials here in North America and not send them over for concrete form work, but actually send them over so that that carbon is permanently stored in these buildings that otherwise would be concrete. We'll improve the quality of people's lives. Wood's a far more beautiful environment to be in, but also will improve all of our conditions from a climate point of view. So the fun thing about this building for me was that they've actually invited, 14 different architects to build little tiny art galleries side by side. And this was a big moment because I got a call, and the architects on the list are like my heroes. They're the big guns of the world. And it was really like, I literally thought they just made a typo or something. And we were all invited to go over together. And if you know for the architects, it's like Norman Foster and Kengo Kuma and Shigeru Ban, and all these guys have been invited, these great architects, and us. And we're going to do this building. But they're all clustered together. And so I thought, as a Canadian, I immediately thought, well, if I'm going to have to build a building next to all these superstars, we're going to just dig a hole and go in the ground and build our building below the ground. We'll build it in wood, but we're going to go below the ground. And then nobody has to kind of compare our building. But the idea actually made a lot of sense because and I didn't know this at the time, it's a coincidence, but the terracotta warriors are a really interesting story about China. The terracotta warriors were found in 3 different areas just in the 1970s. They were there to protect the the grave of the emperor of the Qing dynasty, the greatest dynasty in Chinese history. They buried them in these trenches with these mud walls. That's not just because they haven't excavated that, that's actually how they were originally organized. And the foot soldiers and the cannon fodder, the low-end guys, all were in these sort of shallow ones. And over the top, you can kind of see these little grooves. Over the top, they took trees, and they built these wooden roof structures over the top of the pit. And as soon as I saw it, I thought, oh, that's perfect. That's exactly what I'm talking about. Dig down, put a wood lid on the top. It's going to be kind of a good reference from what they were doing. But even more interestingly, the deeper you went into the pits, so they had the third pit is where the command post was. And they actually dug them deeper, and that's how they evaluated, they created prestige by how deep into the ground you were. So that, you know, the lieutenants of the emperor all were pretty deep. So the reason I'm telling you this story is because we've been playing with around with this solution that we're actually going to dig this gallery into the ground. It'll kind of show up somehow above the ground a little bit. It'll be made out of these materials. But more importantly, we're working on a solution that uses a charred wood roof structure where we burn the wood like a carbon filter and literally bring the air of the building through the roof structure, through the carbon filtering of the roof structure to try to purify it before it goes through the gallery. And so it's our chance to tell a little story, not only that these wood products are pretty exciting, but the ways we adapt the wood products, you know, really using traditional natural systems, are very practical ways for us to start looking at dealing with some stuff that they're just barely learning to tackle around their smog issues. So we'll see how this goes, but it's a pretty fun little project. And, you know, it's really interesting because they are chasing what our image of architecture is. They want big, glamorous, big buildings. And I think we need to do the exact opposite. Start looking at how we do really simple, beautiful buildings that serve people's needs. So the last project I'll show you is just what if. And it's a what if of what does a city look like when it goes big in wood? I don't really know. I don't know that it probably doesn't look like this. For architects, the challenge is every major movement in architecture has happened because of structure. So, you know, the Greeks didn't space their columns the way they did just out of random. They spaced them because there was a rationale, not only an aesthetic rationale, but a functional construction rationale of how big a lintel you could, or beam you could put and lift to that height and span of a certain distance. The architecture followed what was reasonably possible based on the technology of the time. As we fast forward to the industrial age and we started being able to move huge quantities of concrete and steel, it created our skylines. It created every city on Earth, and now, sadly, every city on the Earth looks pretty much the same. It's really sad. We've kind of obliterated any notion of regionalism. And, you know, every tower looks the same, and you have the same architects designing towers in New York and Singapore and wherever. Just like my old firm, right? So, what's that? So so the opportunity here is really interesting. This is the springtime idea, okay? This is why I think we are at the beginning of a new era as designers. When you introduce a new structure, it has a whole new set of rules, and we're still playing with those rules. But it also means we can completely reinvent what the looks of buildings are. Where I think we're going, truthfully, is into a world of 3D printing of biological material for buildings, and buildings will look a lot different 10 years from now and 15 years from now. Wood is the sort of bridging material for that. But it's also the beginning of a very new aesthetic of our cities. So we put this together just for fun to say to New York, this is what it might look like. And this has music too. And then I'm done, and I'm going to take your questions right after this. I showed this in my TED too, so sorry if you've seen it. Much like any other building right now, but we'll see what happens. So thanks, and I'll take some questions now. Kat, you're up first.
Hi, Michael.
Hi.
So this is just incredible, and you know that I'm very energized by this, and I'm sure a lot of the other folks are too. But I'm wondering what 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 things you would recommend that we could collectively do to put our shoulder behind this and make it a reality in here in Seattle or anywhere?
Okay, so bunch of problems or challenges here. One is that there, as I mentioned, 2 manufacturers of these materials in North America right now. There's some folks that are building in Montana. There's some people dabbling with it, but that really can build mass timber. There's only 2, and they're in Canada. That's a problem. We need 3 or 4 in the United States, and soon. So we've got conversations going with folks that are interested in putting them in the Southeast and the Northeast. You know, there's a conversation happening, but until these materials are actually created here, we're not gonna see a lot of buildings here, unfortunately. That could change quickly. The investment's actually relatively small. To build a CLT plant, it's only like $10-15 million, which for me that sounds like a lot of money, but in the big picture, if you're trying to change the world and the way we build, that's not much money. So that's one. 2, you know, we in BC anyway, the lesson I learned was that we needed political will to move these very stubborn forces that control the building code to open some of these opportunities. This is a community solution. This is a solution that's, you know, impacts so many aspects of the economy. It makes sense politically for this to be a conversation. It's also, to me, what's been interesting, a solution and a conversation that works great on the left and works great on the right. And you don't get that a lot. There is a story, an economic story here that's really, really important. There is an environmental story that's really, really important. There's a social quality that's really, really important. So I think, you know, engaging at the highest level of politics is really important. If you get a champion like our premier in British Columbia, if you get a governor, we're working with Oregon State University. Their governor's aware and interested in these ideas. Their state senators are very engaged in it. The more that happens, the easier it becomes, obviously, because we need to accelerate the building code. One of the most important things that needs to happen in the States are innovation zones. So Mayor Bloomberg was looking at an innovation zone. Chicago is looking at an innovation zone around this idea. Bloomberg, less so. Before he left office, they weren't fully up to speed yet, but they are intrigued by these ideas of innovation zones. I think Washington, D.C. is actually an opportunity. DC only has buildings up to 13 stories because of the way it's organized as a city, so it's actually an ideal place to put one of the first buildings. As soon as you get an innovation zone, as soon as you get a building, then you bring everybody together to educate them. That's come visit, and that's where that Wood Innovation Design Center project is so important. If I can take code authorities in Minnesota, and actually we're talking to people right now in Minnesota that are interested in an 18-story building. I don't know how they're going to do it, but they have a relationship with the governor. You know, if we can bring them to buildings and educate them, the moment you walk around the Whittick project, you realize this actually makes a lot of sense. It's not so scary. It's not so confusing. I can literally take a torch to the side of a CLT panel and stand there for a few minutes, and it's not going to burn. And when you do that, and I do sometimes, people start to realize, you know, big pieces of wood don't burn like small pieces of wood. That makes sense. So education, political engagement, innovation zones, and promoting the materials, you know, not only encouraging people to manufacture, but also, I think, and this is important for the schools, provide the support in research to, you know, to look at fire and acoustics and some of these technical challenges that we still have to face, and take that pressure off of the sort of innovators who are, you know, otherwise not gonna make any money trying to push the idea, right? So those are my thoughts and suggestions. More questions? Yep.
Thank you very much for all your work in this talk. I had a question about if there's an application for larger diameter beams, sort of like the older growth in the 105-year-old buildings. I recognize the advantage of the laminated products and the ability to finely engineer them, but is there an application where larger diameter, longer timbers would make more sense?
You know, we pretty much exclusively use engineered wood. When we use a lot of glulam, obviously. What's pretty fun is there's a guy named Andy Buchanan in New Zealand who's developed hollow wood glulam beams that are post-tensioned. So this is like a tube of wood with a cable that runs through it. And after you build the building, you tension it. This is the way we build in concrete, and it creates a very strong beam. So there are a lot of new ways we're working with wood to deal with larger beam sizes and so forth. But I think the days of solid are behind us for the most part. I mean, obviously for high-end residential, there'll be applications, but I think we'll see a little bit less of it. Hi.
Hi, I'm actually in the MARC program, and I was wondering if you have any advice for designers entering the field on how to engage with these emerging new ideas and structures and materials.
Yeah, great question. Well, first of all, get a job where people listen to you even though you're young. Because you know, the practice of architecture often ends up with this sort of, there's a transition in firms where people all of a sudden realize, I'm not making any money innovating, I'm just going to start doing the same thing over and over. You want to catch the early side of that conversation. They need you if they're in the late side of that. I think, you know, I think the challenge, a very significant challenge for practicing architects is cost competitiveness of the solution. One of the problems we have is that when we go out and our client comes to us and says, oh, I'm doing it in concrete, or I'm doing it in steel, I always do it this way, why would I do it any different? If they're a private developer, for instance. And then we say, no, what about this new material? We really like it, let's try some CLT. Then you go through the design process and you get to the costing side, and it comes in too high, because it might. If you don't really know what you're doing, it might be too high. All of a sudden the client says, well, now go back to the drawing board and redesign it at your cost. And that architect never returns to wood again. So this issue of cost competitiveness is absolutely fundamental to it. So as a young architect, you have to be careful not to say, let's do it, let's do it, let's do it. You need to kind of take baby steps. If you jump too far, you might burn the bridge for wood for the longer term, right? There are some great wood innovators here in Seattle. Miller Hall here are getting much more engaged in it, and there's just some incredible talent with architecture here. So, you know, if you're staying in town, I don't think you can go wrong. There's a lot of great firms here to work with that already get wood. And this is, luckily on the West Coast, we kind of get wood a bit more than other places in North America. So the fun thing is there are folks in downtown New York now that are calling us saying they're interested. So it's no longer a West Coast hippie thing to be into wood. Not that I'm helping that story much, but.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Talk to me after, too. I can give you more thoughts on where. Hi, sorry.
So, hi, I would be interested in you talking a little bit about your perception of forest management practices and forest certification schemes, and how do you address the non-carbon related environmental impacts of forestry?
Well, I mean, I do depend on a fair bit of research done by FP Innovations when we're gathering information about, like, I can't remember her first name, O'Connor, who's done a lot of the work on LCA issues and carbon beyond, you know, for transportation and so forth. At the end of the day, it's still significantly better than concrete and steel, at least in our markets. It depends where you are. But, you know, we live in a forest environment, so, you know, the associated issues around carbon are still low, relatively low, compared to the alternatives. That's kind of, you know, that, as I say, I kind of still rely on that. When it comes to certification, it's really complicated, as I'm sure you know. Our forests in BC are mostly SFI certified, not FSC certified. And the problem with that, it gets really complicated around lead issues, and you know, the big threshold for us is First Nations relationships. It gets very, very complicated, and it's really hard for practicing architects to kind of chase. You know, you trust the certification programs, you have to, and they're not perfect. Neither one of them is perfect, or none of the three are perfect. But we end up having to trust them a lot. I think fundamentally you always source from certified practice. Ideally, I tend to be a believer in FSC because I like the sort of more social kind of input they have versus SFI. But it's a very challenging thing for practitioners. You end up trying to trust, you know, from a carbon point of view, the information that's available, and from a certification point of view, we have to trust it to a degree. We can't follow the supply chain. We just can't do it. And our jobs just don't pay us to do it, unfortunately. Yeah. I don't know if that answered your question, but that's kind of my reality in it. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm wondering if you could address the seismic performance of the materials and the way you put them together and how
Yeah.
it would seem like there are some advantages in the materials, but as you get bigger.
Yep. So, so one of the great things about wood is it's a quarter to a sixth the weight of a concrete building. And so one of the things we found early on that frankly just surprised me. So I work, by the way, with Eric Karsh of Equilibrium, who's an incredible wood engineer in Vancouver and deserves 9/10 of the credit for the work we've been doing lately. But what surprised me when we were started early days looking at these buildings, I assumed that you end up with giant columns, giant shear walls, the elevator cores and so forth would have to be really thick. And what we found actually was, to my surprise, the exact opposite. So whereas in a 12-story building, you might end up with a shear wall, the elevator core in concrete 12 inches, in wood it was only 10 inches. And the reason is, if you think about it, the weight of the building is there's a law of diminishing returns in the weight of the building. So the taller you get, the heavier it gets, the more forces in a seismic event or any kind of lateral event that you're going to have to resist. And so if the building's lighter, interestingly enough, it actually makes a dramatic difference. And so whereas there's still lots of technical challenges in dealing with how it ties down to the foundation, and there's some movement issues that we still deal with in a couple different ways I'll get to. To our surprise, it's the lighter weight really answers more of those problems than we would have otherwise expected. In the case for tall wood buildings, our report that we wrote that really first got into this, how do you do it at 30 stories, we used some steel in there for high seismic. We're moving away from it, but we created what's called a strong column, weak beam solution, and the weak beam was actually the steel. Steel has some ductility in it. I don't know if you're an engineer, but it has some ductility in it that we needed because the wood wouldn't give us that same characteristic. So the building is probably 1% steel combined with the wood to really make it work for Vancouver seismic at 30 stories. That's what we found. There's a thing sometimes I like to bring up that our building codes are really established in North America just to perform, that buildings in an earthquake have to perform such that you can walk out safely after the event. They are not required to be usable after the event. So in Christchurch, New Zealand, in Christchurch, when they had their big earthquake, they went back and started surveying all the buildings, and what they found was 1,300 buildings, concrete buildings, did exactly what they were supposed to do. They failed. They failed safely so that people could walk out, but the concrete cracked, the rebar inside yielded, and those buildings cannot be repaired. So 1,300 buildings in Christchurch are being taken down to the ground, and they rewrote the building codes in New Zealand. Japan rewrote their codes. Chile rewrote their codes. Every country that goes through a major event rewrites its building codes to say it better be usable afterwards as well. Now to do that, we don't do that here in North America, or they didn't do it either, because it's more expensive to build that way. The best way to do it is to create self-centering buildings. So a building, a typical building is going to absorb that force up here at the top of the building. The self-centering building literally kind of glides at its base and absorbs the energy at the base, and so the forces and stresses of the building are much less. To do that, the cost of a building is going to increase by 10%. $80 million, another $8 million, it's really hard to get a developer to pay that extra if the building codes don't say he has. So one of the components of research we've been doing, and I was doing in my New York office, which is a lot about disaster and these issues, is what happens to Seattle or Vancouver or San Francisco if we get the big one and all of a sudden none of our buildings are usable anymore? It's one thing that people will die, sadly, because our buildings aren't all seismically properly designed. But worse yet, what's the socioeconomic impact if we can't go move back in? And if you look at what's happening in Christchurch, which is a tiny town relative to our cities, it's devastating. People, that city, is going to take decades to come back to what it is. When we move to self-centering buildings, the reason it's so expensive is because the buildings are heavy. And if you want to absorb that energy at the ground, they're heavy buildings if they're concrete and steel. But because wood is lighter, and this is a huge game changer, I think, when our codes change, and this is something we're hoping the codes do change. When that does happen, wood will be by far the cheapest building material you can choose. And then it's not even a question of whether you do it for environmental reasons. It's just going to be that's the cheap solution, and that's the most safe solution to create a usable building. So I don't know when that code change happens, but that's a really important conversation that has to also happen, along with allowing us to do these buildings. Sorry.
Hi. There are several of us here from a small design build firm based here in Seattle, and we're working on making holistically sustainable buildings. We have been exploring the idea of using CLT. The conversation goes, whoa, that's going to be way too expensive. You shouldn't even think about it. I'm concerned about mass. I'm looking to collect the energy of the sun in buildings. I know there's mass in wood, but I'm trying to figure out how to do the math on that. I'm concerned about certification because we tend to align with FSC and everything we're doing, and I don't know if we can even get it. Is that going to throw the cost through the... Do you have any cautionary tales, or maybe rather some optimistic wayfinding comments for single-family residential? Did I mention that?
Yeah, it's tough. And single-family CLT is hard to make affordable, especially because you're going to be, if you want FSC, your only option is Quebec, right? So here's a little LEED story. Everybody knows what LEED is, right? So I don't know what bridge I'll burn by saying this. I can't stand LEED. It's a prescriptive system. The building code problem in the United States is it's because the codes are written, it's prescriptive codes. Do this, do this, do this. It doesn't say do it and prove it to me that it's a good idea. Prove it to me as a performance-based system works. British code is a performance-based system. Their environmental codes, the German environmental codes, much more performance-based, which means if you're smart and innovative, you get points by being, exceptionally performing much higher than what LEED does. The story with wood and LEED is interesting, and I like this anecdote I tell you, is that LEED doesn't really recognize much about wood as being a positive building material. Doesn't include it as a rapidly renewable, which is tragic as it is. And worse yet, they give you a point if you're FSC, and they give you a point if you're regional. So that Ronald McDonald House project I showed you, we had 2 bidders originally. And there's how in Vancouver, if we build a building, we have to be LEED Gold Plus. That's the rule. So we have very high expectations. So you need every point you can get. So we needed to get 2 points, one for FSC, certified wood, and one for regional wood. The problem is British Columbia wood gives me 1 point because it's regional, but it's not FSC, so I only get 1 point. Quebec wood gives me 1 point for FSC, but it's not regional, so I get 1 point. There was a third bidder that came to the table, and they are an Austrian company. And they said, can we bid on the job? And it's a charity, and I didn't want wood not from North America, but I said, okay, let's see what the price is, and didn't feel very good about it. But ironically, they are FSC, and they ship their material to Victoria through a distributor that the Canadian Green Building Council recognizes as local, and you get 2 LEED points. That's what's wrong with a prescriptive system. So, it's a business. LEED is a business. It's not about what's best for the planet. And, it's good. It's bringing the bottom up to middle, but it's certainly not taking the top higher. And so FSC is a unique challenge in that way. You're obviously better with SFI wood than Austrian wood as far as sustainability. But it's a challenge. I think, for your practice, the biggest issue is you may not want to build in CLT, you may want to build your own CLT. So here, the way we used to build on the West Coast a lot, I did an art gallery in Chinatown in Vancouver, and when you open the walls up, the way we used to create fire-rated walls were to take 2x4s or 2x6s and nail them together. So you get a solid wood wall. So we're in the middle of demoing this building out, and we're finding solid wood walls. And it wasn't the plaster on the outside that was the fire rating, it was the solid wood walls. That's CLT, that's what it is. And so you can, as design builders, that's what I would look at, and I'll actually point you to some projects that are where you guys make your own, and that's how you make it cost effective. We're seeing a lot more of that. We're just buying, low grade spruce fir and you're nailing it together, or there's actually really cool doweling techniques that get away from any metal or any glue. Cross doweling on diagonals and it locks it together. There's some really cool stuff there. So that's the way you start to use mass wood in a more economical way in a smaller practice and smaller projects. I think that's probably the answer. I'm happy to give you some other thoughts too. But let's go here.
My name is Cindy. I've worked in the forest industry my whole career, and you are such a bright light, and I just want to thank you first off.
You're welcome.
So where's the next 30-story building going to be built?
I don't
That
know.
would.
It's really hard. You plant seeds of an idea, and then you got to just go, okay. Everybody that sends me one saying, Sweden's going 32, I get competitive. I'm like, what? We got to get there too. I don't know. All I hope is that, it's going to be incremental. We're not going to 30. We're going to go to 20.
Okay.
20 is a huge step. And then we're going to get to 25. One of the things I often point out is I actually don't think the world needs millions of 30-story tall buildings. There's a whole social issue involved in living in tall buildings that I don't know if I even like. So there's a height that kind of maybe makes more sense. But why 30 mattered is if you aim for the moon, and everybody gets real comfortable down in here, right?
Okay.
You can send a rocket to the moon. Flying around at 40,000 feet doesn't seem quite so scary, right?
Yeah.
And that's really what I think the tallest buildings are about. I hope to see a few, but I don't know that we'll see millions of those.
Thank you.
Sure, one more.
Yeah. I was interested in your comments about the Ronald McDonald House. You clearly, working with wood, had created some wonderful family space, care space, play space. Working with wood, do you find leads you in a different direction in shaping the human space of the buildings you create? Can you say a little bit about that, or what your experience is? You've spoken about the structural stuff so much.
Yeah.
I'd love to know what your aesthetic is.
Yeah. My aesthetic is about simplicity. I believe the essence is comes in the sort of simplest of things. I like this idea that in nature evolves, is about evolution and paring down. The flower isn't beautiful to be beautiful, it's beautiful to attract the bee. I like the idea that in design, we only do as much as we need to. And, the people and the life inside is the beauty. That's easy to do when you put wood into a building. It makes no sense, actually, just from an evolutionary point of view, that humans connect to all these artificial materials around us, right? Well, luckily not all artificial, but it makes no sense. We've only lived in very, very highly man-made, processed, environments for a century. Our connection, evolutionary, has to be much more to natural stone and natural mud and even straw and certainly wood. We have something about us that makes sense. This is what we've lived in for, millennia. And so I think that there's a lot of science still to be had, but without question, wood environments are healthier and happier environments for people to live in. As an architect, it's the great equalizer. I might have some people that say I really like traditional buildings and others that say I like high modern buildings. As long as I put wood in there, they seem to all be happy, right? For me, I'm a modernist. I like really clean, simple space, and I think there's an efficiency and an elegance and like I said, a relationship to nature and simplicity. But it makes my job a lot easier just to throw some wood in there. I do like this idea that when you put wood into a building, because no two pieces of wood are the same, it's like bringing nature's fingerprints into the built environment. I think that's a beautiful idea. And so for the families of Ronald McDonald House who are going through, you can imagine, about the most horrific life experience possible. I mean, typically a kid that's diagnosed with cancer is the next day on an airplane flying to, in our case, BC Children's Hospital to get treatment. Their family life is torn apart. And the responsibility and the opportunity, the honor to build for those families is profound. And so we've spent a huge amount of time thinking about what that life experience and how the physical environment can improve on it. And you know, wood's critical to that, and other natural materials critical to that. I think we're done.
That's great. Well, I would just ask you all to join me once more in thanking Michael for what was just an outstanding talk.